So why did Bob Ferguson apparently attempt to bribe so many dead people last year? Listen, the weirdness and the dark cloud around this guy just doesn't ever stop. And it just keeps getting stranger than anybody could ever actually predict. So let's just get to this latest story. Now, in the last month of 2023, Washington State's Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who's currently, of course, hoping to become the next governor of the state, he decided that one of his distinct campaign advantages is that he could extract cash from businesses and industries around the state, and then, of course, send that cash directly to voters. Keep in mind, he isn't forcing the companies to pay these people money directly themselves. Nope, Bob Ferguson himself personally forces the companies to settle a lawsuit of some kind with the state. And then, of course, Bob Ferguson collects his cash, takes a cut for his office's troubles to cover their costs. And then, of course, he's widely distributing these checks to low-income voters, presumably in an attempt to curry favor and perhaps their vote next November. Now, this specific kickback vote buying scheme actually started years ago when Bob Ferguson, who has actually occupied the office of Washington State Attorney General since at least 2012, filed kind of a series of lawsuits against major chicken and tuna producers, who he claimed were having secret meetings with each other that, of course, colluding to inflate the costs of their products. This basically, therefore, caused the consumer, of course, to pay more than the market price for these products at the time. And these diabolical and evil price-fixing activities by these corporations theoretically happened between 2010 and 2013. Now, we're talking about corporations like StarKist, Bumblebee, and Chicken of the Sea, names pretty much everyone knows. So like most organizations who get sued by Bob Ferguson, these corporations, they didn't want to deal with the drama and cost of just endless forever litigation. So they settled this case with Bob Ferguson. They coughed up about $40.6 million as the price of doing business in Washington State, of course, and then helping Bob Ferguson with his next election. So this helped Bob Ferguson use this cash stash, with which he could basically be generous. I mean, hey, it isn't his money after all. So Bob Ferguson then uses his cash stash and he sends out checks to a little over 400,000 voters in Washington State. Now, there were many problems and significant ethical questions raised by everyone who pays any attention to these issues. But let's just start with some of the more obvious ones. Now, first, I've had numerous reports and copies of these checks sent to me from relatives of dead people all over Washington State who got these checks. And then let me clarify, Ferguson is sending checks to dead people, some of them who have been dead for a long time. For example, here's just one example of one of these checks that were sent to a dead man in Federal Way. This guy actually died in 2001, and so far he holds the current record, as best I can tell, of the person who got a Fergie check long after he died. In fact, dead for almost 23 years now, and Ferguson still wants his vote. I've seen some of them that were dead for many years, but actually this one right here was basically the one who's been dead the longest so far. I've received many emails actually from people who have received checks for dead people, just like they get ballots for dead people in our state. But don't worry, plenty of people who are alive are receiving these checks as well. Ferguson's attempting to capture the live vote as well. So one thing that makes these checks so obnoxious politically and ethically problematic is the fact that every check, as you can kind of see here, it appears as though Bob Ferguson himself is writing these checks. You can see his name at the top of every single check, and his signature is on the attached promotion letter included with each chicken tuna bribe check. So Bob Ferguson doesn't actually sign each check himself. That was apparently too obvious and obnoxious even for Ferguson. But most people who get these checks will believe that they're from Bob Ferguson himself. And there have been a variety of concerns raised about the obvious ethical questions raised, and an ethics complaint, of course, has already been filed against Bob Ferguson on this very issue. But don't hold your breath. I mean, the executive ethics board is really completely compromised to a person, and so I don't think one of them would even dare to confront Ferguson on this tuna chicken bribe check program, at least not if they know what's good for their survival, and really nobody wants to get Epsteined after all. But according to the Attorney General, always a suspect source for any information, of course, but until we get the final records, it's going to be the best source of information that we have right now. He's kicking about $50 or $120 checks to the people that he hopes he can convince to vote for him coming up in November. Now, theoretically, the $50 checks are for single people, and the $120 checks are for families. However, the other question that this raises is exactly, and really how exactly, did Ferguson pick the list of people to whom he's going to send the tuna chicken bribe checks? This is actually a good question because, after all, if this is a payment by tuna and chicken producers for overcharging on cans of chicken back in 2010 to 13, and if you go back and look, there were about 6.7 million people living in Washington State at that time, exactly how did Bob Ferguson decide to choose the lucky 400,000 to get these tuna check, or the tuna chicken voter checks, basically these bribe checks? I mean, how did he pick them? Do they base it on customers who actually bought the tuna or chicken products? Of course they don't. That would be too rational. That'd probably make too much sense, and it would potentially limit the number of voters Bob Ferguson was actually hoping to influence in this case. No, according to the AG's office, they decided to just kick the tuna chicken voter bribe checks out to low-income voters. Low income. This sort of makes sense because if they had to kick it out to all 6.7 million people who live in Washington State, at that time anyway, well, the checks would only be for about $6, which Ferguson realizes is not enough cash to buy anybody's vote outside of maybe a Seattle or Olympia homeless junkie camp. Okay, but exactly what type of list did these guys use? Why is Bob Ferguson sending so many checks to people who are dead, many of them dead for many years, sometimes decades now? Is this a voter list? And does this list actually have a list of people who are still getting public benefits of some kind, maybe? And all the dead people who are getting these Ferguson chicken tuna bribe checks, is this actually exposing kind of a potential fraud? I mean, that Nigerian fraud operations clearly aren't the only ones extracting cash dollars from Washington State taxpayers. I mean, does Bob Ferguson really believe he needs to convince dead people who died so long ago to vote for him this time around? I thought he already had these voters in the bag, but what do I know? Now listen, an obvious next step is to get the list of the Ferguson chicken tuna bribe recipients because it just isn't a secret, it's gonna be public. So I suggest everyone hold on to those checks for dead people. Keep sending me copies of them with permission to use them. I will conceal the bank routing numbers and the names on the checks, obviously, but, and of course, while they may still be able to vote, I'm not sure getting formal signed permission from the deceased voters is really possible anymore. So just permission from the person who's in possession of the dead person's Ferguson chicken tuna bribe check is good enough for me right now. Now, this is all just weird, and it's sketchy behavior from a weird and sketchy politician who knows that literally nobody in the judicial, legal, or political establishment is ever going to hold him accountable, no matter how illegal his actions might be. It doesn't matter if he just ignores government corruption and his corrupt friends, whether he uses his office to basically persecute political enemies and then reward political allies at the same time, or whether he captures the most violent sex predator vote by taking them from McNeil Island and then dumping them next to schools and playgrounds where basically you're next to your kids. I mean, this is really just who Ferguson is. He can't help himself. However, I will point out that politicians who overreach like this, they don't tend to produce the best outcomes in the end. A bribe today can just as easily turn into more abuse tomorrow. The eternal quest for power, money, and control by politicians just like Bob Ferguson, it tends to take them to dark places, and he seems willing to go there with the confidence that he's protected by his friends. In the meantime, while Ferguson continues to demonstrate that there is no constraint on his behavior, no matter how illegal or shady it might be, it's important for us to pay attention, to show up, and to help make us document this stuff. Just like basically the many people who are sending me the checks right now from dead voters. Ferguson may very well be trying to bribe the votes from dead people, but he can't threaten or bribe everyone to vote the way he wants. However, we can only stop bad behavior if we expose it for what it is. We can only do that if we show up. We can't do it by complaining at home or whining about it. We must engage, and we need to show up, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.